Good day, all. This talk will look at how structuralism works by examining key theoretical issues which have emerged in its development. Specifically, I'm going to focus on three issues which together define structuralism's central concept of social structure. First, what is the relationship between structure and action? Second, what is the relationship between structure and function? And third, what is the relationship between structure and system? Now, structuralism is the most abstract of sociology's four basic theories. All of the terms I just gave you are pretty abstract. Compared to Marxism's focus on the economy or feminism's focus on gender, structuralism's focus on social structure is much more general. Just about anything in society can be described as a social structure, so it's a very broad concept. But by the same token, it has become the most widely used concept in sociology. It is used, albeit in different ways, by all four theories. I'm going to begin by looking at the relationship between structure and action, because the simplest definition of social structure is that it is organized action. Action consists of human behavior. Social structures consist of behavior that has been organized into stable, long-term patterns or routines. This can be accomplished through formal organizations like corporations and governments, or through informal groups like family and friendship circles. Either way, for society to survive, human behavior must be made predictable. If everyone just did their own thing, there would be chaos and we'd all starve to death. Social structures organize and enable social cooperation, which is the basis of society. Individuals take action, society creates structures. So, the relationship between action and structure is another way of looking at the relationship between the individual and society. On the one hand, society simply consists of a whole lot of individuals. But on the other hand, individuals are born into a society with social structures which they must fit into. On the one hand, individuals make their own choices and decisions. But on the other hand, individuals are socialized and their way of thinking is shaped by society from the day they're born. So the question is, how much freedom do individuals actually have within society? When you put the question like that, you can see that the action-structure debate is just the sociological version of the old free will determinism debate in philosophy. Are individuals really free, or are all our thoughts and actions determined by society? Different theorists have given different answers to this question, and even the same theorists have given different answers at different times in their lives. When American Talcott Parsons began his career, he was influenced by the American belief in individualism, which is strong, not just in US sociology, but in US culture as a whole. So, he saw society as consisting simply of the actions of individuals, and he called his theory action theory. Instead of the concept of social structure, he used the term action system. This basically means the same thing, except that the focus is on action rather than structure, and so on the individual rather than society. However, over time, Parsons became more impressed by the power of society relative to the individual. Although in principle individuals create society through their actions, in practice he saw that the vast majority of people simply go through the same routines day after day, their lives shaped by forces much bigger than themselves. And so Parsons shifted his focus to social structures and changed the name of his theory to structural functionalism. The difference between an action system and a social structure is that action involves motion, and anything that is moving is changing. It's fluid, like a river flowing. A structure is much more solid and permanent, like a building. Actions can change from moment to moment, but social structures can endure, sometimes virtually unchanged, for centuries. Structures are both more stable and more impersonal than actions. Structures exist independently of any individual, and structures can exist for much longer than any individual. Modern society consists of so many social structures that all any individual does is to play various social roles within these social structures. To some extent, we get to choose what roles we play, but we're still only choosing from a list of options established by society. Parsons eventually came to see individuals as just actors playing roles. We all just read from a script that society has written. In short, Parsons started out on the side of individual free will, but eventually became more or less a structural determinist. Max Weber, whose work overlaps both structuralism and subjectivism, went even further than Parsons. Weber argued that in the modern world, virtually all major social structures have become bureaucracies, and that these bureaucracies are creating what he called an iron cage of rules and regulations which are taking away individual freedom. If the individual doesn't follow the rules at all times, she or he could end up in a literal iron cage, a prison. Parsons and Weber focused on how structure constrains action. However, their critics have argued that this is only one side of the coin. Yes, structures provide constraints, but they also provide opportunities. Without social structures, the individual would have very few opportunities for action. If you want to live without society, then you can become a hermit or so-called mountain man, and that's about it. Social structures create social roles, which do include rules we have to follow, but which also provide us with opportunities to do things that we could not otherwise do. Any role that we play, from artist to astronaut, we can only play because of its supporting social structure. Indeed, the individual can only become themselves, only find out what they like and what they're good at by participating in social structures, especially those of the economy. Your job can be routine, boring, and dehumanizing, but it can also be your main way of expressing yourself, of becoming the person that you are meant to be. I didn't become a sociology prof to get rich, which is just as well, because that never happened. But what my job gave me, and what this podcast now gives me, is the opportunity to express my ideas to others. The opportunity to expand my understanding of the world and to share that with you. Without the social structure of universities and more broadly the education system, I wouldn't have that opportunity, and neither would anyone else. As children, we all have to learn that we have to trade individual freedom for social rewards. We have to learn that we can't just do whatever we want, because if everyone did that, then society would collapse and we'd all starve to death. We have to learn to fit in to the demands and social expectations for each role that we play. In short, we have to learn to play by society's rules. But in return, society rewards us with food, money, and the opportunity to do different things. Life is a balancing act between the needs of society and the needs of the individual. We must fit into society, but we must also look out for our own individual interests. This is why agency theorists have argued that people are not the passive, socially programmed biological robots that Parsons makes them out to be, or the prisoners of society that Weber makes them out to be. On the contrary, people are active agents, making their own decisions and shaping their own lives. This is where people differ from animals. Animals act on instinct. They do what comes naturally. In other words, what they've been genetically programmed to do. But human beings think before they act, at least most of the time. Only humans reflect on their situation, weigh their options, try to figure out the best thing to do, and then act. Agency is the subjective origin of objective action. An agent translates subjective thoughts into objective actions. Sociology tries to understand how thought becomes action. For human beings, action must be guided by thought, and by the same token, thought is pointless unless it can guide action. The famous French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre said, "To be is to do." In other words, if you're alive, you do things, you act. The most basic human motivation is simply to act. Because only through action can we affirm our existence. We can't just exist subjectively. We need to prove to ourselves and to the world that we exist by physically touching that world, by affecting it objectively in some way. If we don't affect the world around us in any way, then it's as if we don't exist. To exist, to be, we have to act. And to exist as humans, our actions must be guided by thought. Thought provides us with an understanding of how to act in a given situation. And also, thought provides us with the motivation to act. Trying to understand the motivations for people's actions has always been a major part of this tradition, overlapping somewhat with subjectivism. Max Weber wrote a book entitled The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, published in 1905, in which he argued that the Protestant work ethic, the idea that God wants everyone to work hard, provided the spirit or motivation behind the rise of capitalism. I shall have more to say about that later in the section on subjectivism. American structural functionalists Kingsley Davis and Wilbert Moore argued that the reason social inequality or social stratification exists is to motivate everyone in society to work their hardest so as to hopefully become rich and, at the very least, avoid poverty. When everyone's motivated to work hard, the economy grows and society as a whole benefits and prospers. Both of these theories have come in for a lot of criticism over the years, and I would argue that each of them provides only a partial explanation of what they're trying to explain. There are a lot of other factors that also need to be considered. However, I would also act that their arguments are valid as far as they go. People must be motivated to act, and people's motivations for their actions are indeed one of the things that we need to understand if we are to understand how society works. The relationship between structure and action can also be better understood if we look at what happens to action in the absence of structure. In other words, how do people act when social structures break down? This is a question that was examined by Frenchman Émile Durkheim. He coined the French term anomie. Anomie has been variously translated as alienation, isolation, separation, normlessness, and as a breakdown of social ties. All of these terms describe an absence of social structures in a person's life. A person can become separated from society's structures either through social upheaval, such as war, revolution, or economic depression, or through personal upheaval, such as bereavement or divorce, which separates you from your family, or unemployment, which separates you from your workmates and from your main activity or purpose in life. When you become socially isolated, you still encounter other people every day, but you lose your emotional connection to them. In your mind, they gradually stop being people and just become things that you bump into occasionally. They become abstractions with no real meaning or relevance to you. Your feelings of common humanity with other people break down. You start to think, nobody cares about me, so why should I care about anybody else? You lose your sense of morality. Since you no longer feel like you're a part of society, you feel like society's moral standards no longer apply to you. Morality regulates your relationships with other people. So, when you no longer have any meaningful relationships with other people, morality becomes an abstraction, something that's not relevant to your life. Morality is for other people. You lose the moral guidelines and the moral compass that society provides. And that can make you a very dangerous person. Persons in a state of anomie are much more likely to commit acts of violence, both towards others and towards themselves. Western popular culture glamorizes the individual. Movies, TV shows, books, and other media over and over show us the lone hero triumphing against the odds. In other words, against society. You've all seen it a million times. The heroic lone cop. His superiors are all corrupt. The bad guys have killed his partner and kidnapped his wife and kids. So he loads up with all the guns and ammo he can carry, blows away a couple of dozen bad guys, and rescues his family. Or, if he's James Bond, he defuses an atomic bomb and saves the world. This is all lots of fun, but it's pure fiction. Durkheim tells us that the isolated individual is far more likely to become a villain than a hero. For example, in recent years there's been a spate of random acts of violence, such as school shootings. The press sometimes tries to make out that these had some political or religious motive, but the story that always emerges is of a loner with no such group affiliations. His family avoids him because he's weird. His schoolmates bully him because he's different. He has no friends. He has nothing to lose. So one day, he buys a gun and starts shooting people. Almost always, this scenario ends with the shooter being killed by the police. And that last part is what can actually allow us to understand this person's actions. Let me ask you, if I were to tell you that tomorrow a dozen random strangers would die, or that tomorrow you would die, which would matter more to you? Your own death, I'm pretty sure. Well, the media focus on the murders committed, but to the shooter, what he is primarily doing is committing suicide. He knows the cops are going to kill him, and usually he makes no effort to get away. Indeed, this scenario has even been described as suicide by cop. The murders are ultimately just a publicity stunt. They're this person's way of saying to the world, you ignored me all my life, but I'm going to make sure that you can't ignore my death. Durkheim argued that a very common consequence of anomie is suicide. People need other people, not just objectively for food and other material necessities, but also subjectively for an emotional connection. Without that connection, life becomes pointless, and people often decide to end it. For example, prisoners in long-term solitary confinement almost always end up attempting or committing suicide. Durkheim wrote a famous book called Suicide, published in 1897, in which he collected statistics which showed that as bereavement and unemployment rates increased or decreased, so did suicide rates. These days, the same also applies to divorce rates. Durkheim also said that teenagers are caught between roles. They're not children anymore, but they're not adults yet. Their family is pushing them to make them their own life, but they might not know what they want to do yet. This can leave them in a state of anomie and confusion, which can lead to thoughts of suicide. These days we have teen suicide hotlines, precisely because teens are a high suicide risk. If you find yourself thinking along these lines, then my advice is simple. Wait. This is a phase, and it will pass. Someday you will meet someone. You will get a job. You will reconnect with society. Just don't give in to the anomie. The negative consequences of anomie tell us that people need structure just as much as they need action. We need freedom, but we also need order. We need to be individuals, but we also need to be members of society. Recent work in the structuralist tradition has tried to see both sides of the issue and establish a more balanced model of the relationship between structure and action. Englishman Anthony Giddens has developed his structuration theory, which argues, in a nutshell, that structure is action. The division between structure and action, says Giddens, is a false dichotomy because social structures consist of people engaging in actions which have been organized, routinized, and patterned until they're stable and predictable. Structure and action are two sides of the same coin. For that reason, arguments about which of the two is more important are just pointless, unanswerable chicken and egg questions. The structure-action debate, like the free will determinism debate, the nature-nurture debate, and all such debates, must end in a draw. Each is equally important because neither can exist without the other. The answer to the question, are we free or are we determined, is both. We are partly free and partly determined. No one is completely free, but nor is anyone completely unfree. Also, freedom is a variable, not a constant. Different individuals have different degrees of freedom, and different societies have different degrees of freedom. Different social positions provide different degrees of freedom. For example, The rich have money, which gives them the freedom to do all kinds of things that poor people can't do, like take their private jet to the Bahamas anytime they feel like a holiday. Children have freedom from adult responsibilities, but they have to do what adults tell them. When you grow up, you have to take on adult responsibilities, but you also get more freedom to do what you want with your life. Every individual's degree of freedom changes as their life circumstances change. On a social scale, changes in society's main structures lead to changes in society's level of freedom. For example, slavery is surely the most unfree social structure in all of history. Slavery took away the freedom of millions of people. The abolition of slavery, therefore, increased the level of human freedom on a global scale. Similarly, the abolition of monarchy and its replacement by democracy have increased political freedom on a global scale. Advances in science and technology have expanded the range of human possibility and human freedom, allowing us to do things previously undreamt of, and social evolution is doing the same thing. To conclude on the structure-action debate, I would argue that part of the problem is that the term structure conjures up an image of something solid, like a building. And indeed, every social structure has its specialized buildings within which it operates. The family in homes, businesses in factories and offices, education in schools and universities, and so on. These buildings are social structures in the sense that they are structures built by society. However, buildings are not, strictly speaking, part of society because society consists of people, not things. Social structures in the strict sense are made up of people in action, people in motion. This means that they're more fluid, more changeable than the concept of structure would suggest. I would argue that the term structure is ultimately too rigid to describe social interaction. This is why, instead of the terms structure and action, I personally prefer to use the terms form and process. Society is made up of social forms and social processes. The relationship between form and process is not as antagonistic or contradictory as that between structure and action. Form and process are more clearly two sides of the same coin. Every form has its corresponding process. Everything can be looked at as a form or a process. The physicists tell us that at the subatomic level, everything is both a particle, a form, and a wave, a process. The distinction is just a question of how you want to look at it. That concludes what I have to say about the relationship between structure and action. We move on now to examine the relationship between structure and function. Structural functionalism argues that every structure exists in order to perform a function. Society has certain needs which must be met if it is to survive, and so society has developed specialized social structures to meet those needs by performing necessary functions. Society would not have developed these structures if they weren't doing something useful. So, any social structure which exists must be performing a positive, useful, and necessary function for society. This idea goes back to Auguste Comte's organic analogy. Just as the body evolved specialized organs like the heart to pump blood, the lungs to breathe air, and so on, so did society evolve specialized social structures, like the army to perform the function of defense, businesses to meet our material needs, churches to meet our spiritual needs, and so on. This model of society is valid up to a point, but it has its problems. First of all, it's one-sided. It focuses on the positive and ignores the negative. It says that if a social structure exists, then it must be doing something good for society. This is an argument that has made structural functionalism popular with the political right, conservatives, and the rich. They say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Because for them, society's working just fine, so they don't want it to change. American Robert Merton was the first to argue that while social structures have functions, they also have dysfunctions. Every social structure has its pros and its cons. Merton argued that there were two main causes of dysfunctions. Firstly, there are unintended consequences, otherwise known as side effects. Nobody can predict the future. Nobody knows all the long-term consequences of their actions, particularly in social terms. People create a social structure to perform a particular function, and it does. But as it does so, it also has harmful side effects. For example, nobody ever sat down and said, I think I shall build something that will destroy the local environment. No. Somebody sat down and said, I think I shall build a factory which will make useful products that people will want to buy. And industry does indeed make millions of useful products. But as it does so, it also creates pollution, resource depletion, global warming, and other environmental damage. For every function, there is a dysfunction. That's part of the balance of society. The second main cause of dysfunction, said Merton, is that society has grown very large and complex. In early tribal societies, everyone lived together and everything was shared, so what was functional for the individual was functional for society. There was no conflict between individual interests, group interests, and social interests. But modern industrial society consists of many large, specialized, semi-autonomous social structures and social groups. The more complex society becomes, the more opportunities there are for cooperation, but also for the emergence of a conflict of interests. The more you divide up society, the more potential lines of conflict you draw. Class conflict, ethnic conflict, religious conflict, gender conflict, and so on. And when you have a conflict of interest, the same social structure can be functional for some people, but dysfunctional for others. American Herbert Gans built on Merton's work, arguing that social structures no longer have to be functional for society as a whole in order to persist. They just have to be functional for or serve the interests of society's leading sectors, meaning the rich and powerful, those Karl Marx would call the ruling class. As long as our main social structures like the market and the state keep making the rich richer, they will persist, even though they're throwing billions of people globally into poverty and doing massive harm to the environment. Capital is very good at ignoring dysfunctions if recognizing them would force corporations to spend a lot of money to fix them. Early functionalism, like that of Talcott Parsons, did not recognize the importance of the concept of dysfunction. More recent work, like that of Jeffrey Alexander, has been more balanced in this regard, and his neo-functionalism has incorporated elements of Marxism into functionalism. However, there's one more problem with explaining social structures in terms of the functions they perform, and that is the problem of illegitimate teleology. Teleology is the argument that something comes into existence for a specific purpose. Clearly, this does sometimes happen. For example, the Saskatchewan provincial government created crown corporations like Sask Energy or Sask Power for the specific purpose of running our utilities. So some teleology is correct or legitimate. However, the critics argue that this does not apply to our basic social structures like the family or the state. These are structures that are capable of performing a wide variety of functions. And in practice, the functions they perform change over time. Basic social structures do not come into existence to perform a particular function. And basic functions don't have to be performed by a particular structure. If a function is important, then society will provide a variety of functional alternatives, meaning different structures that are capable of performing the same function. For example, every society has to perform the function of growing food, but there's a variety of social structures which can grow food. Family farms, agribusiness corporations, state-run farms, religious communes, slave plantations, and so on. This is why identifying the functions that a structure performs now doesn't necessarily tell us why that structure originally arose or why society chose that structure over the other alternatives. And this is why structural functionalism has been criticized for being descriptive, not analytical. It's good at telling us what's happening, but not so good at telling us why it's happening. I would argue that the problem of illegitimate teleology, and indeed most of the theoretical problems of structural functionalism, go back to an initial confusion in the work of Auguste Comte. Comte developed his model of society by borrowing a model from the biology of his day. But early 19th century biology had only a very limited understanding of how biological organisms like the human body work. They didn't even know about germs, let alone things like DNA. So they developed an oversimplified model of the body, which biologists these days refer to as the mechanical model of the body. When they looked inside the body, all they saw were specialized organs working together like the parts of a machine. In other words, all they saw was cooperation. And so Comte's model emphasizes social cooperation and sees conflict as an aberration. But modern microscopes have shown us that our bodies are also a constant battleground between our immune systems and invading microorganisms like COVID. Nature contains both cooperation and conflict, and so does society. This is part of the balance of nature and of society. Both nature and society are more interactive and more complex than early scientific models thought. In short, Comte thought he was comparing society to a biological organism, but he was really comparing society to a machine. A machine is like a biological organism, but it's simpler, more rigid, more deterministic. And so, as structural functionalism built on Comte's work, it developed a model of society which was valid up to a point, but which was ultimately too simple, rigid, and deterministic. I have already criticized Talcott Parsons for being too deterministic, and I've argued that the concept of structure is too rigid. I would now go further and argue that the concepts of structure and function are both terms that describe machines better than people. Machines are structures that perform functions. People are more complex than that. Similarly, Davis and Moore's concept of social stratification compares social differences to strata, or layers in the earth, and so draws an analogy with geology, not biology, an inorganic analogy, not an organic analogy. Instead of comparing society to an organism, structural functionalism has in practice been comparing it to a mechanism, and so has developed an oversimplified model of society. I would argue that to understand basic social structures, structuralism has to get back to a genuine organic analogy. Basic social structures are not like machines created to perform a specific function. Rather, they're like living organisms that are born and then look for ways to survive. I saw this happen in Poland with my PhD work on the rise of the independent trade union Solidarity in 1980. In the summer of 1980, Poland's economy collapsed. Food grew short, and nobody had any faith that the ruling Communist Party could solve the problems. So, there was a nationwide strike wave which culminated in the creation of Solidarity. Solidarity was the first large-scale organization in the entire Soviet bloc not run by the Communist Party, apart from the church. It was therefore much more than a traditional Western trade union. It was the people's organization, and it would do whatever it could to help the people. People came to the Solidarity offices with every conceivable problem: finding food, finding a job, finding a place to live, finding a babysitter, and so on. Because there was no precedent for this type of organization in the Soviet bloc, there were no specific expectations for it. It was not created to perform a specific function, just to help people in general. Now, after a few months, new leaders emerged in Solidarity who were less cautious than the early leaders, and who decided that the best way to help the people would be for Solidarity to form its own political party, which could then take power from the communists. Well, that was too much for the Communist Party. They were prepared to put up with an independent trade union, but not an independent political party. They declared martial law. Solidarity was shut down and its leaders were put in prison. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Solidarity was reborn. But with Poland becoming a capitalist country, Solidarity began to operate like a regular Western trade union, which it still does. But when it was formed, nobody knew exactly what Solidarity would do or what functions it would perform for society. Solidarity's role in society was not predetermined. It was only established by the unfolding of historical events, which included both cooperation and conflict between different social groups, different classes, even different countries. Solidarity grew like an organism, adapting and overcoming adversity. It was not purpose-built like a machine. And that logic applies to society as a whole. Society contains both individuals and groups who rationally plan and organize social activities and social structures, in particular, governments and businesses. However, no individual or group planned or built society as a whole. All of society's basic structures, such as the family, the state, the market, culture, and so on, came into existence organically. That is why sociology is still trying to understand society, because it's not a machine that we built. It's a living organism that was born and has grown according to principles that we're still trying to figure out. That concludes what I have to say on the relationship between structure and function. The third and last issue in structuralism, which we shall examine here, is the relationship between structure and system. Here too, I would argue that the confusion of mechanism and organism has led to a confusion between structure and system. At present, different theorists use these terms in different ways. Some use them as if they were almost completely different concepts. Others use them almost interchangeably. Perhaps the problem can be cleared up if we go to that great fount of knowledge, the Oxford English Dictionary. The OED defines structure as supporting framework or whole of the essential parts of something, complex whole. And the OED defines system as set of connected things or parts, complex whole. So, both a structure and a system are a complex whole, or in other words, a whole made up of parts. Now that may not sound like much to make so much fuss about, but actually it is. Because if something contains a whole and parts, then the whole is not reducible to the parts. I'm sure you've all heard the expression, the whole is more than the sum of the parts. But how is that possible? Surely the whole is the parts. If you take away all the parts, then the whole is gone too. And yet, it turns out that when you put all the parts of a whole together, you have more than just a collection of parts. You have a whole. For example, if you buy a jigsaw puzzle, then at first all you have is a random collection of puzzle pieces. Each piece just has what look like random patches of color on it. It's all meaningless. Because even though you have all the pieces, you don't have them in the right order. But if you put the jigsaw puzzle together properly, then a bunch of meaningless parts become a meaningful whole, a picture of something. The whole is more than the sum of the parts, because the whole only comes into existence when the parts are put together. If you were to examine each jigsaw puzzle piece individually, without trying to put them together, then you wouldn't even know that there is a big picture, let alone what it is. It's only when parts become a whole that something new emerges. Something that's based not just on what the parts are, but also on how they're put together. Because in order to make parts fit together into a whole, they can't just be thrown together any which way. The pieces have to be put together in an ordered pattern, or they fall apart. That pattern is what is more than the sum of the parts. That pattern is what is sometimes called a structure and sometimes called a system. Because structure and system organize or integrate parts into a whole. However, that still doesn't tell us the difference between structure and system. One possibility is that it's a matter of size or scale. Perhaps a system is simply a large structure. Some theorists use it that way. However, I would argue that that is close but no cigar. Because quantity has two basic aspects. size and amount. To fully quantify anything, you have to ask two questions. How big is it? And how many are there? Size ranges from micro to macro. Amount ranges from few to many, or within a single whole, from simple to complex. I would argue that size is not the issue. Structures can be large or small, and so can systems. The issue is how many parts is the whole made up of? Structures are made up of a small number of parts. Systems are made up of a large number of parts. So, a system is made up of structures, but a structure is not made up of systems. In short, structures are simple, systems are complex. In my preferred terminology, both are forms. Structures are simple forms, systems are complex forms. A mechanism is a structure because it's made up of relatively few parts. An organism is a system because it's made up of many more parts. Even our most complex machines contain only a few thousand parts. But it takes millions of gene pairs just to make an organism as small as a fruit fly. Durkheim understood this distinction. He called early, simple, tribal societies mechanical societies, and modern, complex industrial societies organic societies. Now, taken literally, this terminology is contradictory. Early society is more organic in that it is closer to nature, while modern society is more mechanical in that it is full of machines. However, by mechanical and organic, Durkheim meant simple and complex. Early tribal societies are simple in that they have only a small number of social roles, and each tribe is essentially a single family structure. Modern industrial society has hundreds of different types of social structures with thousands of different social roles, and so it is a complex system. Durkheim argued that while greater social and economic complexity have allowed us to increase productivity and so feed a much bigger population, it has also had negative consequences in terms of growing social inequality, growing anomie or alienation, growing crime levels, and other social problems that were virtually non-existent in early tribal societies. Modern society is not just much bigger than tribal society, it is much more complex. This makes it much better in some ways, but much worse in other ways. Because systems are more complex than structures, that makes systems more fluid and interactive than structures. A structure, even though it's made up of a number of parts, is essentially a single unified form. A chair, a car, a building, and so on. But a system is made up of structures, each of which has some independence of action, as people do, and each of which in society develops its own interests. This means that where the parts of a structure fit together and always cooperate, the structures in a system sometimes cooperate, but also sometimes come in conflict. And that is not necessarily a bad thing. While conflict is destructive in the short term, it is very often creative in the long term. In society, war and revolution sweep aside old social structures so that new social structures may be born. For example, the French Revolution had to chop off a few aristocrats' heads with the guillotine to allow France to make the transition from monarchy to democracy. This also means that systems are much less predictable than structures. Their actions are much less deterministic. The problem for structuralist theory has been that apart from Durkheim, its major figures have often not understood the distinction between structure and system. Kant did not. He thought he was drawing an organic analogy, comparing society to an organism, when he was really drawing a mechanical analogy, comparing society to a machine. Modern society is a system, but he described it like a structure, which made his model oversimplified. And Parsons did not. Even though he sometimes called his model systems theory, in practice he came to see society as one big structure or machine, with people just as cogs in that machine or as biological robots, with their lives determined by social structures. Well, society is not that deterministic, and neither is individual life. No one is completely free, but everyone is partly free. Jeffrey Alexander has attempted to develop a more interactive and less deterministic form of structuralism with his neo-functionalist theory. While this does provide a more sophisticated model of society, most sociologists still identify structuralism with Parsons and tend to think of it as an oversimplified and mechanistic model. This is why outside the US, structuralism is in a bit of a decline. However, I believe that its theoretical problems can be resolved, especially by creating a more up-to-date and authentic organic analogy, one based on modern biology and scientific knowledge. I shall have more to say on this in later talks. But for now, that concludes what I have to say on structuralism. A written transcript of this talk is available in the video description box if you're interested. Good day all.